The morning sun rose slowly over the endless stretch of prairie, casting a pale golden light that barely touched the frost that clung to the grass. Caleb Hart pushed open the cabin door and stepped out into the cold air, feeling the familiar bite of winter against his skin. He had grown used to the quiet of the wilderness, where the wind carried only the sound of his own footsteps and the distant call of wild creatures. His hound, Rufus, padded beside him, a faithful shadow with ears twitching and eyes alert. The two of them had lived this way for years, away from the noise and burden of townsfolk, far from the memories that still haunted Caleb's heart. He carried his rifle and set out toward the forest, where the mist still lingered between the trees. His breath came out in white clouds as he walked through the snow-covered trail. Each crunch of his boots seemed to echo through the stillness. Rufus ran ahead, nose to the ground, tail wagging. Caleb smiled faintly, the closest thing to joy he had known in some time. Out here there were no debts, no expectations, only the rhythm of the land and the silence that kept his mind still. After some time, Rufus stopped, suddenly head lifted, body tense. Caleb froze and listened. The forest was silent, except for the faint rustle of wind through the branches. Then Rufus barked once, a sharp sound of urgency, and darted off the trail. Caleb followed, his pulse quickening. He trusted the hound more than he trusted most men, and if Rufus had found something, it was worth seeing. They broke through a thicket and entered a small clearing. The sight before him made Caleb stop cold. Half buried in the snow was a wagon overturned. One wheel, splintered, the other half sunk into the earth. Broken crates and torn fabric were scattered like the remains of a lost world. Rufus whined and pawed at a motionless figure lying a few paces away. Caleb rushed forward and knelt beside the body. It was a woman, her skin pale as the frost, her dress torn and soaked through with ice and mud. Her hands were stiff, her lips bluish and cracked, but when he touched her cheek, he felt the faintest flicker of warmth still clinging to her. He pulled off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, lifting her gently into his arms. She was light, too light like a ghost made of breath and bone. He looked around but saw no other movement, no horses, no travelers, no signs of life. Only the frozen remains of a journey cut short. A torn piece of paper caught his eye, half buried in the snow. He picked it up and read the smudged ink that still clung to the page. It was a letter of promise, written in a careful hand. The words spoke of a woman traveling west to marry a man she had never met. A mail order. Bride. Caleb stared at the letter and then at the woman in his arms. Her chest rose weakly with each shallow breath. He could not leave her here to die. The wilderness had taken enough lives already. He shifted her weight carefully and started back toward the cabin. Rufus trotted beside him, glancing up as if urging him to hurry. By the time they reached the small wooden cabin, Caleb's muscles ached and his breath came hard, but he laid her gently upon his bed and began to stir the fire to life. The flames crackled and filled the room with a growing warmth. He rubbed her hands, trying to bring color back to them, speaking softly, though she could not hear him telling her to hold on just a little longer. Outside, the wind howled across the plains, but within those rough cabin walls, the world seemed to pause. Caleb Hart, the lonely hunter who had once turned his back on the world, had found a stranger on death's edge, and in that moment, something within him stirred, something he thought he had buried long ago. The fire burned steady through the long hours of the night, filling the cabin with its soft orange glow. As the storm raged outside, Caleb sat beside the bed, his eyes fixed on the woman who now breathed with faint but steady rhythm. Her face was pale, yet no longer lifeless, and a strand of golden hair had fallen loose across her cheek. He brushed it away gently. the touch awkward from a man unused to tenderness. Rufus slept by the door, his head resting on his paws, but every now and then his ears flicked as if he too kept watch over the stranger. When dawn came, the light fell through the cracks of the shutters and touched her face. She stirred slightly, a small sound escaping her lips. Caleb leaned forward, his voice low and rough like gravel. "You're safe now, miss?" he said, though she did not open her eyes just yet. He brought her water warmed by the fire and wet her lips carefully. After a few moments, she swallowed weakly. Then her eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes the color of clear. "River water, where am I?" she whispered, her voice faint and trembling. "You're in my cabin," Caleb answered. "Found you half frozen out there near a broken wagon. You're lucky my hound caught your scent." She tried to sit up but winced and fell back against the pillow. Her gaze drifted to the fire and then to the man beside her. "I remember the wagon," she murmured, then a noise, men shouting after that, nothing. Her brow furrowed as if searching her own memory. Caleb poured her more water and handed it too, her steadying her hand when it shook. "You've been through hell," he said, "but you'll live." She looked at him then, as if trying to measure his kindness against the rugged lines of his face. "I owe you my life." "Stranger," she whispered, "my name is Evelyn Grant." He nodded slowly. "Caleb Hart, Mom," he replied, still wary of speaking more than needed. Days passed, and strength began to return to her. She moved about the cabin on unsteady feet, tidying what she could, helping with small chores, insisting on earning her keep. Caleb tried to protest, but her resolve was quiet and firm. She spoke little of where she came from, though her manners and the soft way she spoke hinted at a life far removed from the rough frontier. She flinched at sudden noises and sometimes woke from dreams with a frightened gasp. Rufus followed her everywhere, tail wagging as if he had chosen her as his new charge. Caleb watched her from time to time as she fed the fire or mended a torn sleeve. Her presence filled the cabin in ways he had not expected. The silence that had once comforted him now seemed different, no longer empty, but alive. He found himself listening for the soft rhythm of her footsteps or the quiet hum of her voice when she thought he was not near. One evening, as snow fell thick outside, she sat by the fire reading the letter he had found near her wagon. She stared at it a long time, then folded it neatly and placed it aside. "I was meant to be a bride," she said softly. He looked at her, surprised at the sudden confession. She kept her gaze on the flames. "But that life feels like a dream, now a dream that turned cold in the snow." Caleb wanted to ask more, but something in her tone held him back. As the wind howled beyond the cabin walls and the fire burned, Caleb felt a stirring in his chest that unsettled him. He had lived alone for so long, he had forgotten the warmth of another soul near his. Yet as he looked at Evelyn, her face calm in the glow of the fire, he knew that something had changed, though he could not name it, not yet. Winter began to loosen its grip on the land, and the heavy snows slowly melted into streams that ran clear between the rocks. The forest came alive once more with the distant calls of birds returning to their nesting places and the faint green shoots that pushed through the soil. Caleb and Evelyn had fallen into a rhythm of quiet companionship. She would tend to the small garden behind the cabin, and he would hunt or trade in the nearby town. Each evening they shared a simple meal by the fire, their words few, but their silence growing more comfortable with time. Still, Caleb could not shake the feeling that something about Evelyn remained hidden. Her eyes sometimes drifted toward the window as though expecting someone or something to appear beyond the trees. When she thought he was not looking, she would trace her fingers along the edge of the locket that hung around her neck, a silver piece worn smooth by years of touch. She never spoke of it, And Caleb never asked, though. The curiosity grew in him like a restless seed. One day, Caleb rode into the nearby town of Haven's Bluff to trade furs and gather supplies. The place was little more than a cluster of wooden buildings and muddy streets filled with settlers and traders trying to survive the harsh edge of the frontier. As he handed over his pelts at the general store, he heard two men talking near the counter. Their voices were low but sharp enough to catch his attention. "You heard about that missing girl," one of them said. "The rich man's daughter from back east, the one that vanished before her wedding." Caleb's hand stilled over the coins. The other man spat into the dirt floor. "I the same one. Rumor is she was taken by outlaws or ran off on her. Own foolish thing, if you ask me. Some say she headed west, maybe hiding under another name." Caleb felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. The description that followed the golden hair, the blue eyes, the delicate manner left no doubt in his mind. They were speaking of Evelyn. He kept his face still and finished his trade quickly before mounting his horse and riding home through the dusk. The cold wind bit at his face, but his thoughts burned hotter with each passing mile. When he returned, the cabin was lit by firelight, and Evelyn stood at the table folding the small pieces of fabric she had been sewing. She looked up and smiled softly, though there was tiredness in her eyes. Caleb set down his pack and stared for a long moment before speaking. "Where did you say you came from again?" he asked. His voice was calm but edged with something she could not ignore. Her hands froze over the cloth and the color drained from her cheeks. "I told you I came from the east," she said quietly, but she did not meet his eyes. He took a slow breath, then held out his hand. "The locket. Miss May, I see it, please." Her fingers tightened around it for a heartbeat before she nodded and placed it in his palm. He turned it over, and there engraved faintly, in silver, was a crest, a symbol of wealth and lineage, one no ordinary mail-order bride would ever possess. Evelyn watched him in silence as he set the locket down between them. Her voice trembled when she finally spoke. "I did not lie to you, Caleb. Not about everything." Her gaze lifted to meet his, but in her eyes, there was both fear and sorrow. "I just could not tell you the whole truth. Not yet." Caleb felt the conflict rising inside him, anger struggling against compassion. He wanted to demand answers, yet the sight of her trembling hands softened him. She looked not like a deceiver, but like someone carrying a burden too heavy to bear. The night stretched long after that moment. The wind pressed against the cabin walls, and neither of them spoke again for some time, but as Caleb sat by the dying fire, the words he had overheard in town echoed in his mind, and he knew the peace they had found together was about to be broken. The night after Caleb's discovery hung heavy with silence. The air inside the cabin felt thick, as if even the fire hesitated to burn. Evelyn sat by the hearth, her face pale in the flickering light, while Caleb stood near the table, his hands resting on the rough wood, his thoughts twisting like tangled roots. He wanted to believe her, to trust the gentleness he had seen in her eyes, but the truth pressed against him like a weight that could not be ignored. He had lived too long in the wilderness to mistake danger when it came quietly wearing a kind face when... She finally spoke. Her voice trembled at first, then steadied as though she had been holding back for far too long. "I was never meant to be anyone's bride," she said. The words fell softly, yet struck hard against the quiet. "I was promised to a man. My father chose a man who saw me not as a person, but as property." Caleb lifted his gaze, his jaw tightening as she went on. "He was powerful, cruel. His name was Lawrence Henton, heir to a factory empire back east. My father owed him more than money. He owed him loyalty. So I became part of the payment." She paused, her eyes distant, as if seeing the past unfold before her. "I could not bear it," she whispered. I begged my father to release me, but he would not. So I ran. I took what little I could and left under the cover of night. I found a woman in a nearby town who sold me the papers of a mail-order bride. She had decided not to go, and I thought if I traveled west under her name, I could disappear, start anew. But they came after me. Lawrence's men sent to drag me back. The wagon I was in was ambushed. I remember shouting, horses screaming, and then the snow. I thought I was going to die. Caleb listened in silence, every word sinking deeper than he cared to admit. He had known men like Henton, men who thought wealth made them gods above consequence. Yet there was something else in her story that unsettled him. She had trusted no one, and for good reason. Still, she had landed in his hands a man who wanted no part in the affairs of the powerful. The thought that her pursuers might still be searching gnawed at him. He looked toward the window where darkness stretched endlessly across the plains. "You should have told me," he said at last. His voice was low, steady, but edged with hurt. "You brought danger to my door without a word." She turned toward him, her eyes glistening. "I wanted to, but I was afraid. You've been nothing but kind, and I did not want to see fear in your eyes, too. Caleb, I thought maybe I could have peace here even for a little while." Rufus stirred near the door, lifting his head as if sensing the unease that filled the room. Caleb rubbed his forehead and sighed. The fire cracked between them, throwing shadows that danced like ghosts across the walls. He could not look at her without seeing both the woman he had saved and the storm that now followed her. Yet beneath it all was something stronger, something that made him ache despite himself, the quiet truth that he cared for her more deeply than he wanted to admit. "We can't stay here," he said finally. "If they're still hunting you, they'll find this place sooner or later." Evelyn's hands tightened in her lap. "What will you do then?" she asked. Caleb looked toward the rifle resting by the door, his eyes hard as stone. "Whatever I have to," he said. Outside, the wind began to rise, carrying with it the promise of change. The peace of winter had shattered, replaced by the tension of a coming reckoning. Caleb knew the wilderness would not stay silent. For long somewhere beyond the tree line, men were still searching, and soon they would find their way to his door. Inside the cabin, Evelyn's gaze lingered on him, filled with fear and something else, a flicker of hope, fragile but alive. And though neither spoke, it was clear that the path ahead would test them both more than either had ever known. The storm came at dawn, fierce and sudden, carrying with it the kind of cold that cut straight through bone. Caleb was already awake, his rifle in hand, when Rufus began to growl low and deep from the doorway. Evelyn stood near the fire, her face pale as ash, her fingers clutching the edge of her shawl. Caleb moved to the window and peered through the frost. There were riders approaching, 3 of them, moving slow but sure across the plain. Their coats were black and their shapes blurred by snow. Yet Caleb could tell from their posture that these were not lost travelers. They were hunters of men. He turned back to Evelyn, her eyes searching his. "What will you do?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. He took a breath, steady and sure, and said, "Whatever it takes to keep you safe." She shook her head, fear and guilt written across her face. "You don't owe me this, Caleb. I brought this upon you." He stepped closer, his voice rough but quiet. "You didn't bring them here. They chose this path. Same as I did when I found you out there in the snow." The riders drew nearer, the thud of their horses' hooves muffled by the wind. Caleb opened the cabinet and handed Evelyn a small pistol. It was old but well kept. He showed her how to cock it and where to aim. Her hands trembled as she took it, but she nodded, determination flickering through her fear. Then he sent her to the back room, told her to stay low and keep quiet. Rufus stood ready at his side, muscles tense, eyes fixed on the door. The first man called out when he reached the yard. His voice was sharp, cutting through the storm. "We know she's here, hard hand her over and you'll live." Caleb said nothing. He waited as the men dismounted and began to fan out around the cabin. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then the door burst open and chaos followed. Gunfire thundered through the small room, splintering wood and filling the air with smoke. Rufus lunged at the first intruder, dragging him to the ground while Caleb fired. Twice, striking another who had tried to flank through the window, Evelyn cried out from the back room but stayed where she was, just as he had told her. The fight was short, brutal, and filled with the smell of gunpowder and snow. When it ended, the only sounds left were the crackle of fire and the ragged rhythm of Caleb's breathing. One of the men still lived, lying wounded near the doorway. Caleb knelt beside him and demanded to know who had sent them. The man spat blood and whispered one word: "Henton." Before his eyes went still, Caleb closed them with a grim hand, then stood and looked toward Evelyn, who now stood trembling at the edge of the room. She ran to him, the pistol still clutched in her hand, and he caught her as she fell against his chest. "It's over," he murmured, though he knew it was not truly over. Not yet. Evelyn wept quietly, her tears warm against his skin. "I never wanted anyone else to be hurt because of me," she said. He held her close, his voice low. "You were worth saving," he told her, and meant it. Days later, when the snow began to melt and the world softened into spring, Caleb helped her write a letter to her father. She told him she was alive but would not return. She asked for peace, not permission, and for the first time in her life her words felt like her own. They sent the letter with a passing trader and watched him ride off into the horizon. Life slowly returned to the cabin. The days grew longer and the air warmer. Rufus healed from his wounds and spent his afternoons lying in the sun. Evelyn tended to the garden while Caleb repaired the damage to the cabin. Though the shadows of their pasts lingered, neither spoke of them any more. They had both lost something in the world and found something else. In its place, not perfection, not peace perhaps, but a kind of quiet belonging, as the sun dipped low one evening and the sky burned gold. Evelyn looked up from her work and smiled. Caleb met her gaze, and for a moment the silence between them said more than words ever could. Two souls once broken, now bound by chance and choice, by survival, and by something deeper, something that neither of them dared to name but both finally understood.